Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Global defense spending hit $1.917 trillion in 2019, a 3.6% increase over previous year figures, and the largest increase in 1 year since 2010. The findings are put out in the annual report by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. The United States remains the largest defense spender with $732 billion, or 38% of global military spending. China is a distant second with $261 billion at 14% of global total. India at number 3 with $71.1 billion at 3.7%. Russia spending $65.1 billion at 3.4%. And Saudi Arabia with $61.9 billion at 3.2%. Pietri statement said, and I quote, global military expenditure was 7.2% higher in 2019 than it was in 2010, showing a trend that military spending growth has accelerated in recent years. This is the highest level of spending since the 2008 global financial crisis and probably represents a peak in expenditure, unquote. Large year-over-year increases are seen in China, 5.1%, India, 6.8%, Russia, 4.5%, Germany, 10%, and South Korea, 7.5%. Regionally, military spending increased in Europe by 5%, Asia and Oceania by 4.8%, the Americas by 4.7%, and Africa by 1.5%. Combined military spending by the 29 NATO member states was $1.035 trillion in 2019. Together, the top 15 countries spent $1.553 trillion, 81% of global military spending. All but 3 countries in the top 15 had higher military expenditures in 2019 than in 2010, the exceptions being the US, 15% drop, the UK, 15% drop, and Italy, 11% drop. To discuss these trends and what they mean, we are joined by Professor Michael Clarke. Professor Clarke was Director General of the Royal United Services Institute, also a professor at King's College London, and Pieter Wezeman, who is Senior Researcher, Arms and Military Expenditure Program at Pietri, Stockholm. Thank you to both the panelists for joining us. Since this is a Pietri report that I am pegging this segment on, let me begin with Mr. Wezeman. Mr. Wezeman, give us a sense of what these trends show.
I think overall it does show that there is an increase in military spending, and that is by itself something which we should be concerned about. It does show that some of the major states in the world, in particular the US, China, Russia, are again competing against each other in military terms, and that is of course a concern too. And then of course there are wide differences within different regions. We see, for example, that in Africa there's not much of an increase. It's only a small military spending region, but the diversity in development there is really enormous, and there are major concerns about how military spending may affect a poor region like that. Take, for example, the Middle East, another region where we see very high levels of military spending, which are, of course, closely related to the tensions and the rivalries within that region. So each of these regions, we see different developments, which I think we should discuss separately because they are very diverse and not necessarily showing one kind of homogeneous development throughout the world.
Okay, I will come back with more questions, Mr. Wezeman, but let me go to Professor Clarke here. Professor Clarke, are we looking at a return after 2 decades of essentially war on terror back to major power rivalries and tensions, and that is the reason for this spike?
I think that's very much part of the world economic and military order that we now have. That there are the 4 big players who are United States, China, Russia, and India, and they're all big players for different reasons, but they are big players, and they are the 4 players that in effect set the weather for the rest of us. They actually create the political weather for the rest of us. And what you can see is the return of great power politics in the world, on top of the fragmentation and the tendency towards terror and towards state collapse that we've also seen for the last 20 or 30 years. So it's as if a rather old-fashioned pattern of great power competition is overlaid on a new pattern that we've only seen really since the middle of the Cold War of tremendous state fragmentation. So it makes for a much more disordered world. It's not necessarily more dangerous than it was 50 years ago, but it's certainly more disordered and it's more difficult to understand.
Okay. Now, one of the things, taking the cue from what you've said, if we consider China as the challenger, the rising power, of course, the Chinese talk about the fact, and, on this program, I very often talk to Chinese experts, and they say, well, there is no such thing as a Thucydides trap, and we are not into this kind of thing. But quite apart from that, the pattern that we have seen is that there's a spike in the Chinese defense expenditure when the economy is growing at a faster pace, and when it slows down, as it is slowing down, that they cut down on the defense expenditure. Also, even though China stands at number 2, as I said in my opening, it's a distant number 2. Now, give me a sense of the huge differential between the US defense spending and Chinese defense spending, and I'm not even counting in the US allies in NATO at the moment. I mean, the US spends more just on R&D than the entire defense outlay of China. So what does that indicate?
In general, yes. I mean, China is catching up with the United States in lots of ways, but the US is determined to stay ahead. And the figures are quite dramatic because, as you said in your introduction, I mean, NATO, if you take the United States and its NATO allies, between them, they make up about half of all military expenditure in the world, and the rest of the world makes up the other half. And that's a reflection of the history of the last 30 or 40 years. But it's changing fairly quickly because China is determined to not compete with the United States as it were system for system, but China is determined to have a countervailing strategy which actually creates some dominance in the Pacific, certainly in the Western Pacific, and has some capacity to defend Chinese interests in Eurasia. So what we're seeing is a fairly distinct shift. And although China is a very distant second to the United States, the nature of the intentions behind it are towards strategic competition, which is mainly economic, but will also have a military dimension.
Okay. I'm going to come back with the issue of how China addresses these asymmetries. And I completely agree with you, Professor Clarke, that China is not competing system to system with the United States. But let me go back to Mr. Wezeman here. Mr. Wezeman, Professor Clarke talked about the 4 powers and included India in that. Now, India is in one of the top 5 spenders. But the last military round, that when India aggressed against Pakistan and there was an aerial skirmish, India did not really come out looking very nice in that. And the Indian air chief talked about the fact that if they had the Rafales, things would have been different. They, of course, they've also got the S-400 system from Russia, and the 1st Regiment will get to them by 2022. So is this an issue of spending a lot, but as a book which was put out by the late Professor Steve Cohn and Dr. Salil Das Gupta, it was titled Arming Without Aiming. So is that the case? Are there any structural problems in acquisitions in India that despite spending so much, they have not really got the kind of conventional superiority over Pakistan as they should have?
As they should have is, of course, always a difficult question to answer. The reality is that one would hope that both countries would seek peaceful resolution to the conflicts and tensions that they have had since their independence. And I think this is what we focus a lot on when we talk about military spending here at CIPRI, namely the fact that this kind of military spending, whatever its military output may be, whatever the real military capacity of India may be right now, those are things which we don't even want to think about, that they would even try to do that. But more important is to, again, find that peaceful resolution to the conflict between the two countries in order also, and not only that, but also to lower military spending, to be able to go away from a military spending, which for Pakistan, for example, is, in our estimations, 4% of the GDP. It would be, of course, much better if that kind of money could be spent on things like healthcare and education. And I think there we have to have a close look at what this spending actually means. It is extremely difficult to say anything about how the level of military spending lead to a certain military capability. There are so many factors at play, and yes, as you can see in the case of India, which did not succeed to achieve its real military objectives, you could argue at least against Pakistan last year. And that shows that spending a lot does not always lead to high levels of military capability. The problem is, of course, that exactly because they might not have succeeded in what they wanted to achieve, that is, again, a reason to then seek more funding for military spending, and an even higher percentage of GDP being spent on military spending at a time that we are dealing with an economic recession and also a pandemic.
Absolutely, I agree with you. Here's the problem. You know, if you recall, Salvador de Madariaga, who was once chairman of the League of Nations Disarmament Commission, he famously said the trouble with disarmament is that the problem of war is tackled upside down and at the wrong end. Nations don't distrust each other because they're armed. They're armed because they distrust each other. But leaving that aside, Deloitte also put out a report in 2019 called the 2020 Global Aerospace and Defense Industry Outlook. And they also predicted that 2020 spending will grow 3 to 4% to touch $1.9 trillion. They ascribed it to chilling relations between the USA, China, and Russia. So this does go back to what I was talking with Professor Clarke about the great power competition after 2 decades of the global war on terror. Is that the sense of Cypriot also?
Absolutely. I think the great power competition explains definitely a lot when it comes to the increase in military spending that we have seen. We have already talked about that relation between the US and China, and of course also the relation between India and China. It is, of course, not necessarily Pakistan anymore which drives most of the kind of military spending in India, but it's also very much that the military development in China, which is actually causing India to increase and to try to expand its military capability. But we also see something similar in Europe. Here in Europe, we see that relationship with Russia has gone really sour over the years, in particular, of course, after the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014. And that is one of the key reasons why we see an increase in military spending in many countries in Europe, in particular in countries in Central Europe, and also very much important in the past few years in Germany, one of the biggest economies in the world, which has now also set its aim to increase military spending to potentially even up to 2% of their GDP somewhere in the coming 10 years. Now, of course, all this, once again, is a peak which we see in 2019. As we all know, it's extremely difficult to predict anything for 2020, considering the pandemic and considering, of course, the economic recession that is caused by the actions that are taken to do something about the pandemic. However, despite that, we already see now a few cases where countries have already announced what they're going to do in the coming year. And I just mentioned one example, and that's Norway, which just the other week decided to continue to increase its military spending despite the economic recession, despite all those questions about the economy and the ways about how to deal with the pandemic. But they still argue that there is that threat and that great power competition, which for them is reason to continue to prioritize defense over certain other spending.
Yeah, but it's very interesting. I mean, going back to what you said about India before I go to Professor Clarke, the issue of China, but, you know, from where we stand when we look at this, If you look at the order of battle of the Indian Army and the fighting elements and the deployment, we see that much of it is Pakistan specific. But Professor Clarke, give me a sense of this uptick. Is this primarily for modernizing and replacing aging military equipment? Does this have something to do with the emerging technologies and the R&D into those technologies and the development and deployment of those technologies?
Yes, it does, and this partly goes back to what we were discussing earlier, the push that China has got in order to create, as it were, a competitive military base. And China is using all of the best technologies that it can find, and that has the effect of making other powers think a bit more strategically. That's one of the reasons why India is now behaving in a more globally strategic way, partly because it's been provoked to by the competition that China now represents. And you can see the same in the military policies of states like Indonesia and Vietnam and Japan, that people are reacting to the fact that we are on the verge of a military revolution in the 2020s and 2030s towards very high-tech systems, probably systems which are not as based on firepower, but based on sensors and electronic measures and ways of getting inside someone else's defense system and their decision-making loops. And that push towards different sorts of technologies is coming essentially from China, and therefore other powers in Asia are taking their cue from that. So I think we're on the verge of quite a big military revolution, which may or may not turn out to be a good thing, but it will certainly be expensive.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Professor Michael speaking with us. Let me go back to Mr. Wezeman here. Mr. Wezeman, so the increased NATO spending that I talked about in my opening, obviously with reference to the Pietri report, this seems to be owed to the commitment to spend 2% of their GDP. Is that the Trump effect?
Don't think it's really a Trump effect. He may claim that it is so, but then again, he claims so much in those things. It is important to realize that already in 2014, or a little bit after that, after the annexation of Crimea by Russia, NATO states together kind of reinforced that guideline, which they already had before, but they made a very clear statement that now it was really the time for all of them to increase their military spending to 2% of the GDP. So I don't think we should really say that the GDP or that the 2% guideline is that what drives the NATO states to increase their military spending. It is the other way around. They have a driver. They see that there are increased threats, primarily in Europe, from Russia. That's where the threat perception lies. And that leads them together to agree to go for 2% of GDP. Some of those states have already reached that point. Others have kind of promised it. And again, others, such as Germany, have an internal discussion which is still ongoing, where they do know that there is a certain pressure from the side of the US, in particular from the side of Trump, saying that if you don't increase your spending, we have to pull out more. And of course, that puts some pressure on the debate in Europe too. But overall, it is the threat perception towards Russia, which I think is the most important factor in the increase in military spending in Western and Central Europe.
It's very interesting. Okay, before I ask this question, let me say that we're also joined by Mr. Vasco, the Cruz Amador. He's an analyst, founder and CEO of Global Intelligence Insight. London joins us from Lisbon. But Mr. Wezeman, it's interesting you talk about the Russian threat. Now, there is this energy dependence. And we also know that Trump wants the European states to rely less and less on Russian energy, but hasn't really given them an alternative. Now, are you saying that at the end of the day, in terms of the threat perception, the European states are going to fall on the side of the US because the threat perception is primarily that of the US, and it seems to be sort of being supplanted onto the European states also? Is that the correct way of looking at it, or perhaps there is a real Russian threat? What's your sense?
No, I don't think it's the American perception which is pushed upon the Western and Central European states. I think this is a true threat perception from those states itself. Take, for example, a country like Sweden, where I live. Even there, we see that, especially after the annexation of Crimea, but also other actions related to, for example, internet security, cyber attacks and all that, where often the finger is being pointed at Russia, even though it's very hard to prove, of course. Still, there is that overall sense that somehow Russia may try to do again what it has done in Crimea and before, for that matter, in Georgia in 2008, that it wants to continue that aggressive policy of slowly expanding its influence and even its territory in European states, particularly the Baltic states. And there is a sense that this is something which Russia has to be deterred from. This is not necessarily coming from the US. I think this is a clear threat perception.
So this is a sense within the European states. Mr. Amador, we were talking about the CIPRI report. We were talking about the uptick in defense spending. Now, we are now going through, the entire globe is going through this pandemic. Do you think there is a sense that some of the non-traditional security threats like pathogens and environmental issues and the rest of it are also becoming big, and that spending or allocation needs to also look at these threats?
My topic and what I would like to raise awareness is the importance right now that we have with the focus and the threats across the cyber perspective, which I think is a common topic that we need to be aware of the threats that we are dealing with. If we are going back to 2005, 2006, or even around 2010, we were used to deal with security and defense budgets. And on that time, we know well how we can apply them and how we can work with that, because we can identify the threats. And nowadays we have two factors that we need to deal with, which is how to deal with the cybersecurity threats and how to deal with the way that we are applying the budgets within the cyber intelligence perspective and the cyber intelligence beat, because we've got plenty of illicit actors, criminals, terrorists as well, gaining advantage and taking advantage from the cyber perspective, which is becoming higher and higher, not only since 2014, but actually after the Paris attacks back in November 2015, and then all the online topic and bit that is becoming higher, like being the internet as the biggest tool being used by illicit actors against civilians, against nations, and across the globe. And then the basic and the most important issues right now, and which we need to raise awareness, is the advantage that all the sponsors are getting from this pandemic, because they know well that everyone is being fully concentrated and fully concerned about fighting back, how to fight back this virus, and they are getting advantage, getting more acquainted with this topic as well, which is, I think that we need to take care, we need to protect even higher, because in a daily basis they are conducting a huge kind of threats which we need to take care of.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was Vasco the Cruz Amador speaking with us. Mr. Wezeman, stay with me. We shall take a short break and return to continue with our discussion of increased global defense spending in 2020. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We're talking about the Pietri report and the spike in defense spending. But the question is, and that's what we've been looking at, has the idea of security changed or should change given non-traditional security threats? Now, here's the thing. The U.S. Department of Defense had warned of the coronavirus threat. It was a 103-page U.S. NORTHCOM Branch Plan 3560, Pandemic Influenza Infectious Disease Response. It studied and noted the threat and warned that the country would be massively underprepared. Competition for and scarcity of resources will include non-pharmaceutical countermeasures like ventilators, devices, personal protective equipment, such as face masks and gloves, medical equipment, and logistical support. Now, here's the thing. Will this change? And to discuss this, we have Mr. Pieter Wezeman still with us, Senior Researcher, Arms and Military Expenditure Program at Pietri. We're also joined by Mark Sleboda, the International Affairs and Security Analyst, joins us from Moscow. Mr. Sleboda, is going to change in terms of allocations, in terms of looking at the fact that there are certain threats that cannot be countered through the usual military systems and platforms?
I think that coming next year, we will see globally a cut in military spending, but it won't quite necessarily be for a reevaluation of conventional and strategic military spending vis-a-vis the problems we've experienced globally with the pandemic crisis. I think it will be much more related due to economic budget concerns with the amount of money that will have to be spent. Those aren't necessarily directly linked. And also, which countries do cut their military spending and by how much will entirely differ from country to country. I would actually expect the U.S. to see very slight military cuts. The U.S. is able to fund its military budget with its the globe's use of the dollar as a reserve currency via quantitative easing and an ever-increasing over $20 trillion national deficit. But I think definitely in Europe, in Russia, perhaps in China, we will see military funding decrease a not insignificant amount, but probably not as much as those whom are wishing for a reprioritization of what we define as security would like to see.
Right, that's very interesting. Mr. Wezeman, would you agree with Mr. Sleboda that there's likely to be a cut in defense spending, but that's not necessarily because there's going to be an increased awareness of non-traditional threats, but because the economies are going to slow down in the wake of this pandemic?
I think I'm afraid I will have to agree that it is likely that the first and foremost reason for cuts in military spending will be simply the lack of money, and therefore that we don't necessarily are going to see cuts in military spending which are going to lead to a lower military burden, or in other words, that we will see a lower percentage of the GDP being spent on military activities. Yes, there will of course be a pressure not only to deal with the economic effects of the pandemic, to have the stimulus packages and all those kind of things in place, which of course will compete for money which could be spent on the military. But there will of course also be a pressure to overlook and oversee how the healthcare institutions in the world can be improved, so that if there would be a similar pandemic as this occurring in the future, we can react faster and better. We have the equipment in place, we have the medication, or at least the means to develop medication quicker and all those kind of things. But it is still questionable to which extent that will really dent, that particular aspect will really dent the military spending. The threat perceptions that exist will also exist in the coming years. In Europe, there still will be wariness towards Russia. In India, wariness towards China, in Pakistan, a wariness towards India, etc., etc. And I think those will drive continued military spending at a relatively higher level. But again, as the resources will run out, it is likely that we will see a decrease of some percentages in the coming year or maybe coming years. But then it also depends very much on how fast the economy will recover again.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, history is on the side of your viewpoint, because if you go back to the 1918 pandemic, you know, the tail end of First World War, and you know, various estimates of people, 20 million to 50 million to 100 million people dying, but that didn't really turn out to have some kind of rethink on how to, you know, look at the security threats. And 20 years down the line, there was another World War. But Mr. Sleboda, before you joined us, there was this discussion about one of the reasons for this spike has to do with the world sort of moving on from 2 decades of the war on terror to great power competition once again, chilling relations between the United States, Russia, China. And Mr. Wezeman also spoke about, I asked him, I said, is this, you know, the increased spending in Europe, is this because of the Trump effect? Trump asking the NATO allies to, you know, fulfill their promise of having 2% of defense spending of their GDP. But Mr. Wezeman was of the view that this is also because of the Russian threat. Now, give me a sense of what this Russian threat possibly can be.
Well, the Russian threat on one hand has to do with Russia's intervention to stop U.S. and allied military aggression, be that the failed proxy war in Syria or against the overt invasion and military occupation of East Syria that we see there. That's certainly part of it. And another part of it has to do with increasing tensions in Eastern Europe after the 2014 U.S. and European-backed putsch overthrew the democratically elected Ukrainian government, leading to a civil conflict in the country, with NATO supporting the new regime in Kiev, Russia supporting the people in the east and in southern Ukraine in the Crimea, which then broke away from the country and voted in a referendum to rejoin Russia. So this push of EU and NATO institutions, in particular, this was an EU association agreement in Ukraine that sparked the conflict, has led to increasing tensions in Europe, and that is a big part of what is perceived as a Russian threat. Of course, Russia sees it the other way around. They see a increasingly aggressive U.S. and NATO active not only in their backyard in Europe, but around the world, overthrowing governments, active militarily in almost a dozen countries around the world. And China sees something very similar with increasing U.S. militarization of the Western Pacific on the other side of the Pacific from them, in an attempt to erect some kind of, they call it a containment zone, basically prepping military points all around China and trying to herd Pacific countries into some type of NATO-type loosely alliance against China there. So I mean, there is threat perception, but there's quite different threat perception on both sides of these looming great power tensions.
Absolutely, and precisely what increases the tension and the possibility of miscalculation. Thank you so much. That was Mark Sleboda speaking with us. Mr. Wezeman, this is the primary reason for miscalculation, because one of the things that I remember the late Robert Strange McNamara in his documentary talked about, lesson number 1 is to empathize with one's adversary. but it seems to me that that is actually easier said than done. Since you at Pietri, deal with these issues, is there some framework in and through which adversaries can look at each other from the other's perspective?
I think it's always extremely important to stress the need for diplomacy, the need for transparency, the need for sharing perceptions. And in that light, I think it is, of course, of a concern not only that we have that superpower or that major power competition kind of coming back into the world and driving higher military spending levels, but also that there are, of course, continuously tensions which leads to the fact that the major organization that you deal with is the United Nations is not really functioning as it should, that it is increasingly difficult in the field of armament and disarmament and arms control for the major power to find common ground, to agree on mechanisms where you share information and also where you share this type of perceptions. For example, within Europe, where you share information about what you have in terms of military capability, where it is, why you deploy it in certain regions, or what your intentions are. And these frameworks have to be strengthened. And when we then see that there is an erosion, that, for example, within the US, a country which has supported these mechanisms in the past, but that a Trump administration is not seeming very keen to really structure and support these international fora in the same way as in the past, is, of course, of major concern. And I think that's something which we should really strive for, and maybe more strive for than actually trying to increase military spending and military capability.
Absolutely, I agree with, the paradox is, if we talk about these multilateral agreements, we talk about confidence-building measures. Now, multilateral agreements, the US walks out of the climate treaty, the US walks out of the JCPOA. That doesn't really send a good signal. As for the CBMs, they seem to work the best when you need them the least. And that's the paradox. But I'm also joined by Mr. Andre Pietri, who is a director of the Joint European Disruptive Initiative, joins me from Paris. Mr. Pietri, thank you so much for being with us. We're talking about, the defense expenditure hike, which is with reference to the Pietri report, annual report. We're also looking at the issue of whether, given the current pandemic, given the environmental issues, that we are now at a certain inflection point in history where we can see that there are threats which are non-traditional and that we need to understand them, we need to allocate monies to them, and we need to begin to look at security from a different lens. Do you think that's going to be possible? Because up until now, the discussion with my experts tells me that that's probably not going to happen.
I think we all need this to happen, because what just happened is probably a lack of foresight. And this pandemic, we all know about the famous TED Talk of Bill Gates in 2015. I think there were even reports, I think by the CIA in 2008, showing that the next big thing will be pandemic. So it's not a black swan. So the first conclusion that we should take out of it is that the need for foresight has never been higher than in this current period. And this is where military capabilities and part also of the budget should be allocated, is really trying to understand in these exponential times that threats are also exponential, like this pandemic, and has major security consequences.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. This wasn't a black swan event. There were lots of warnings. There was a Department of Defense report that I talked about in my opening, which said that the US was underprepared for this kind of thing. But here's the issue. Despite all the warnings, there was no sense of urgency, or perhaps there is the organizational bounded rationality which says that, since you have a certain level of part dependence, that you keep moving in certain grooves and you never really look outside for any new signals. Now, that being the case, Do you think this is a sort of, the world has been shaken up and perhaps there's now going to be greater realization?
Probably, because defense spending, like all other spendings, are following some kind of a return on investment, the return being either pure military strengths or political influence, or and never it has been calculated what would be the cost of not preparing. Unfortunately, we currently have this healthcare crisis, which is a massive tragedy, but we will have, following that wave, a major economic crisis at proportion probably none of us has ever experienced. And this will hit us, and it will be easier today, if I may say it like that, to kind of say lack of foresight could lead to these -5, -10% of GDP that many of the countries in the world will experience in 2020. So hopefully, when we will allocate defense spending, when we will think about how to allocate our resources, the non-conventional threats, we talked a lot about cyber, space is a new field, and probably this whole biological environment will be much more taken into consideration. That's one point. And the second point, probably it needs a change in the way leadership is seeing where it gets its ideas from. It cannot be the traditional, I would say, industrial complex, which, it's very hard for incumbents to change their point of view. So
Absolutely.
we probably need to have much more diversity, having new voices joining in and showing that pandemics is a major security threat. And it's not just an outlier that was sometimes seen.
Before I wrap up, let me go back to Mr. Wezeman here. Mr. Wezeman, what Mr. Pietri is saying makes a lot of sense, and I agree with him, but here's the question: how?
How? Yes, I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is that we talk, as you already say, the pandemic is not a black swan. Biological threats, they are not new. We have already non-traditional security threats. They are actually traditional. Pandemics are traditional. This is something which has threatened humanity since humanity has existed. And still we kind of struggle to find the right priorities between how we use the resources we have to deal with different threats which we perceive. And I think here it is important, what was mentioned before too, that there are, of course, also not just purely rational assessments, such as, okay, I see a threat. I do believe that my neighboring country has arms and is going to potentially use them against me. But there are also other factors that play a role which are extremely difficult to control. In the area of military spending, the military itself and the arms industry have, of course, a vested interest in always trying to pursue higher military spending, or at least stable military spending. That's going to be a very important part of this discussion, to how to control these vested interests in order to be able to spend the money on the right priorities.
Absolutely. So much. That was Mr. Pieter Wezeman. Thank you, Mr. Andre Pietri, for speaking with us. This is it for tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time for latest updates. You can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.